Good morning. Welcome to Turn It Up. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are sitting on the traditional custodians, the land of the traditional custodians on which we meet. Now, of course, we're all meeting in different places, and I live on the land of the Dja Dja Wurrung people of the Loddon River tribe in central Victoria. And I'd like to pay my respects to them, their culture, their elders past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to pay my respect to the traditional owners of the land on which you all sit. My name is Matthew Gordon. I'm the client executive at Kapir Consulting. What a year. In addition to a crisis of political leadership, record-breaking bushfires and floods, a global climate emergency, a pandemic, and a parallel economic recession, 2020, when will this end? At this time of year, we need to pause, reflect, regroup, and get ready for an almighty recovery. So this week, we will bring an incredible list of humans, leaders, communicators, politicians, facilitators, academics, and captains of industry to explore the role of inclusive community engagement in a post-COVID recovery and what an inclusive engagement might look like from here on in. As the quiet voices risk falling silent, the disengaged disappear, the role of community engagement could not be more important than now. Welcome to Turn It Up, a virtual conference brought to you by Kapir and Friends. Today we'll be recording today's session, and for those who would like a copy, they will need to sign up to our newsletter. All the videos from the conference will be published via email, and the link will be shared on your screen right now. We'll also be sharing slides and any other feedback surveys via the email newsletter, so please ensure that you're all signed up. Our session today will also be interactive. We'll be hosting a couple of polls and some chat, so you'll be able to ask some questions directly to Benson Saulo, our first guest. For those who would like to network and meet others from today's session and throughout the rest of the conference, head on over to our Facebook page, facebook.com/turnitup conference, one word. The Facebook page link will be posted to the chat, so head on over there and keep the conversation going. To launch this conference, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Benson Saulo on What is the Voice. Benson, are you there today? Here you
Matthew,
are.
I am. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful to have you here. Now, I've actually introduced you a couple of times in the past, so I've had a bit of practice editing down your enormous biography. So as a bit of a time saver, I've got a few dot points to share with our audience today. Benson is a descendant of the Wemba and Gunditjmara Aboriginal nations of Western Victoria and New Ireland province in Papua New Guinea. Benson is the first Indigenous appointed Consul-General to the United States and will be moving to Texas very shortly. He's also a member of the senior advisory group appointed by Indigenous Affairs Minister Ken Wyatt to co-design the Indigenous Voice to Parliament. Previously, Benson, you were the head of partnerships and investment at Australian Unity, a wealth and capital markets business, an Australian Human Rights Commission medalist for youth, a NAIDOC Youth of the Year, the founding director of the National Indigenous Youth Leadership Academy, an Australian Youth Representative of the United Nations in 2011, and most impressively, Benson, you made it to Clio's 30 under 30 in 2014. You came 26th.
Benson, just behind Daniel Ricciardo.
Well, there's always next time.
Yeah.
Benson, thanks so much for taking some time out of your busy schedule to meet with us today. Look, Ken Wyatt is expected to take options for an Indigenous voice to Parliament, to Cabinet, really shortly. I understand the final report's being drafted right now. You've been involved in the advisory group to date, and the process stems from an ongoing conversation with Indigenous Australia, and most recently the Uluru Statement in 2017, which recommended that a voice be enshrined in the Constitution. As a participant of this latest process, why has the process for effective Indigenous representation been so long, drawn out and difficult?
Yeah, it's such a good question, a great place to start, Matthew. And when I think about that long drawn out process, addressing that to start off with, when we think about, in 1967, when 90% of Australians voted in favour for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders to be considered recognised citizens within our own country, that was on the back of a 10-year long campaign, and so we know that these great changes take time. It's incremental, and it's hard. These are hard fought victories to get to, and so in the last 7 years or so, 7 to 10 years, we've seen that movement around constitutional recognition. Then you also, as you mentioned, the statement from the heart, which is calling for the enshrinement of an Indigenous voice in the Constitution, as well as looking at the voice, treaty and truth, so that truth-telling piece, but then also that agreement between Indigenous Australians and other Australians, and then also this current process around the fleshing out the actual mechanism that enables an Indigenous voice into Parliament and an Indigenous voice into government, particularly on matters that impact our people. And we don't see these these movements in conflict with each other. In fact, this is all about kind of building to that next stage. If we think about incremental changes, it's about raising the awareness, raising the conversation, getting to a statement that people can really understand and kind of garner support behind, that being the statement from the heart, but then actually doing the hard work, the difficult work, the challenging work of developing that mechanism that actually engages all Indigenous voices to be able to actively participate, to actively identify and identify representatives from communities, to then be able to feed in to government at a local, regional, and then a national level. And one of the challenges that we have seen and we continue to see, which is coming from a place of it's fantastic in the sense that there's over 250 nations within Australia, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations and language groups. The challenge is around how do you then get the representative democracy or the representative models that enable these nations to be able to participate not only at a local level, but at a national level, at a regional level, and then a national level. And this is the challenging element that we've really found over the last 12 months as we've been working on this model is we're not starting from a clean slate, in the sense of we're creating something new. There are structures that are legislative bodies. There are bodies that are community-led and community-owned. There are bodies out there that actually the people running them are all elected from their community or members from their organizations. And so you can't just push all these aside and go, well, actually, we're going to start again. And we're going to start from a point of now we're holding elections. We need to actually recognize and respect these bodies that are out there, but then also be able to channel towards how do you actually engage all members, all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander members across communities. We think about the movement here in Victoria around the treaty movement, and then also the elected body that was established here. This was groundbreaking, and this is a fantastic movement. One of the challenges and one of the criticisms that is exists around that model is that it only engaged about 7% of the Aboriginal population down here in Victoria. And so the goal that was very much established by Minister White was, he wants all Indigenous voices to be able to participate, to feel that the representatives that are speaking at that state level, that national level, actually do understand what's happening for them on the ground, but then are able to make decisions at a national level.
So, I mean, we think a lot about representation in a community engagement process. It's the challenge of formulating a representative group of 250 nations is a stark challenge. I'm kind of curious to learn more about some of the specific kind of issues or risks or minefields that you need to be aware of when developing or co-designing a process with such a diverse cohort of nations.
Yeah, so there's kind of two elements that I'll probably touch on just for the sake of the conversation. There's many. One element is going to be around representation and legitimacy. And we'll touch on that word legitimacy of voice. And then the other side is the ability for government to be able to listen, to hear, to be able to have that seat at the table. So there's two parts to this. I'll start from that point of legitimacy. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders as communities were some of the most researched communities, were the most consulted communities. And so this idea of consultation fatigue continually comes up when constantly being asked by our own people, but also from governments and by non-Indigenous organizations around, well, what do you want? Tell us what you want. And the challenge with that is not necessarily seeing great change or significant change on the back of so much consultation and research. And so there's that fatigue of, well, here's another thing. Oh, here's another thing that I have to, give feedback through, and and maybe I'll get a $50 gift voucher. As an aside, this is the challenge of going to communities constantly, but not necessarily having the mechanism to be able to listen, to hear, and to affect change based on what you're hearing in regards to the feedback. Then the other element is around legitimacy. That idea that who are you to speak for my community does come up. And that idea of that local representation, I will steer clear of the term kind of grassroots, and potentially we could touch on that, or it might come up in questions. But that idea of that local representation, this is also linked to family groups. This could be also linked to kinship structures. This could be also linked to wealth as well, and power, like community power as well. So these are who has the ability to speak on behalf of communities. This is a very challenging dynamic within communities itself, but then also to be seen as a legitimate leader as well, or a legitimate representative of the community, because of that question, well, who's this person? What's their connection back to community? And who are they to speak on my behalf? This is the real challenge that we have within our communities, that element of trust, legitimacy in the process of advocacy and representation. So that other side that I wanted to quickly touch on was also around the ability for governments or organizations to hear. There's this idea that we'll just kind of have engagement models and they'll be fine. We'll have advisory groups or whatever, and they can just plug straight into an existing structure. And this is where we've always kind of fallen down, because we're not actually valuing or recognizing the governance models that actually exist within communities, and also the rigidity of models within systems, within Western systems or institutions. And so I almost think about them as kind of revolving at different speeds. There's no right or wrong in this kind of instance, but they're just unable to really kind of plug in. And this is where the idea of co-design is so critical, because both models or both structures need to adapt or shift to be able to actually interface with each other. But that can't be seen. The challenge with that is then suddenly they're being seen as being compromised models. And so this is where the element of co-design is so important, where you have the legitimacy from both sides in regards to how they're viewed, but they're actually being able to work together to find, not only set an outcome, a higher order outcome, but then to understand, well, how to best bring in the minds, how to best kind of set the table for everyone to be able to be convened and work together to get to that outcome.
I'm curious about those revolving, let's call them systems.
Yeah.
I mean, is it a case that there could be some compatibility with the right leadership and mix and co-design, or are they just are we dealing fundamentally with a clash of systems that will never find, because there is a compromise on both sides, and I'm curious to learn about your experiences in that co-design model, because it strikes me as requiring an incredible amount of flex.
Yeah. Well, I like this saying. It says, "Never say never and never say always."
Okay.
Yeah, and I think there isn't. I think there is at a certain level an incompatibility, because there is community governance in regards to even around elders, succession planning of bringing youth in, sitting at the table, being very consultative, being very deliberate, but also taking time. And so that idea of time, say if you layer that into a funding model or funding system, or a political cycle, then these kind of the process of decision making, suddenly who you're dealing with can change, or you may not have the resources to be able to continue that that process. So there's a level of incompatibility, but at the same time, I think particularly recently, we have seen a coming together under that higher order banner. So we think about the recent close the gap targets that were set. This is the first time that we'd ever seen an Indigenous man as as Indigenous Australians, Minister for Indigenous Australians, standing next to Pat Turner, who is the chair of the Coalition of the Peaks. So over 50 community-controlled health organisations standing next to each other, setting the vision forward to close the gap in regards to health, education, and also justice outcomes. We are seeing a lot of goodwill in regards to that co-design, but I still think there's a lot more work that needs to be done in regards to how do we make these systems, if not kind of revolve together, but to have a little bit more touch point in regards to that co-design, which has to be underpinned with respect and trust, but then also long-termism as well.
I suppose beyond the values of and principles of respect and trust, and there's a comment in the comment thread from Kamaya about, I guess, a willingness to be flexible of the engager, that is the government in this case. I'm curious about what you've kind of learnt or experienced through this kind of consultation process around what needs to be done to better drive a hearing or a listening from the government side, those in power.
Yeah, this is so like I love when people bring up that idea of will and willingness, because I think that's such a powerful element, which then leads into a particular stance as well. So it's a want, it's a longing almost, and I think that's such an impassioned word when you're talking about government, that longingness, but in this kind of context, but you do want that will, which is very important, and we are seeing that. And I think that example around the close the gap, the ongoing support around the community consultative models that we are doing with the voice to Parliament and the voice to government, but the thing, will only get you so far. When I work with organizations, the first thing I try to identify when working with, say CEOs or executive level is, well, what's the will? What's driving them? What is the ultimate goal that they're striving for? But then, will dissipates. It's actually tangible actions that are required. And when I think about tangible actions, that idea of co-design, but more than that, it's actually the feedback loop, because otherwise it's extractive. And what we have seen in the past, particularly from processes being led by institutions or say governments, it has been extractive. It's kind of taking information and then building it over to the side. Whereas, we all know that in a co-design model and, being a consultative, having a consultative framework is actually not building it to the side. It's about bringing it together and building it together and then applying that. And it's the will that's going to get people to the table, but it's actually that next level of commitment that keeps people at the table building together.
I'm curious about some of those tangibles. What's been, and I'm particularly interested in maintaining that will / avoiding that fatigue. What are ways in which, people in positions of power can, not only commit to process or, demonstrate that willingness, but what are ways in which they can demonstrate sort of a genuine, we're hearing it, we're valuing it, we're understanding it.
Yeah. I think this comes back to, the idea of power in itself. And over the many years, there has been a process of removing power or decision making from communities. And this is not just Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, this is all communities. And I think there's a great opportunity, particularly as we're becoming more aware or looking at that recovery and that notion of bounce back, or, even that kind of place-based approach, is actually for people, in decision-making positions or people with power to have that element of kind of empathy, that stance of kind of stepping back and stepping in as well, to actually return or share power back into decision-making spaces. And that actually comes with a great level of vulnerability. And unfortunately, when we think about, politics more broadly, and I'm not, this is not in regards to any particular party, but that idea of vulnerability, unfortunately, we can get parties and political, and leaders can get attacked for showing vulnerability. And so that means there's that not that motion of giving back power, because it actually is around holding power then. So that's something that fundamentally actually needs to shift within our society in regards to valuing vulnerability, valuing power being returned. And, there's a term that actually was born out of the kind of the disability space, which was the dignity of risk. And I love that notion, because it's the ability to take risks, to make choice, to be self-determining, knowing it may not always be the right choice as kind of determined by others, or the risk to succeed as well. And I think when we think about risk in regards to returning power back into communities, there's only one form of risk that's really being viewed. It's not being viewed as the opportunity. It's being viewed as I'm losing something, or I'm foregoing something, or I'm giving up something. So vulnerability, dignity in risk, or the ability to sit in risk, but then also to be able to trust in an outcome.
Yeah. We've got just about 20 more minutes for today's session, and I'm keen to start some of the questions from the audience. So we'll start those in a few moments. We have a couple of polling questions that we want to launch. I just want to grab an idea here before we do so. For those who do want to put a question to Benson, we'll do our best. There's well over 100 people on the call. If you could just address the question in the chat function to all panelists and attendees. So that's addressing it to all panelists and attendees so we can see the questions coming through. I'll do my best to kind of get to them as they come through. But just on this idea of the vulnerability of the engager, if you will. One thing that I see in community engagement is we often measure the success of community engagement by how the participant feels. Do you feel heard, valued? Do you feel like you made a meaningful contribution to the discussion? Did we close the loop? Did we provide that feedback to report how your ideas or your feedback informed or influenced or otherwise a decision. What we don't tend to measure, and it's around that kind of vulnerability, is how has the engagement process changed the engager? They've sat at the knees of people in their community that they're seeking feedback from. They've sponged it up. They've taken in all of this, these stories, narratives, insights, and it's kind of ingrained in them. I'm kind of curious about the importance of being a sponge and how we report that in a public setting.
Yeah. So a sponge can only absorb, using this analogy, if it's actually, squeezed out first,
Right.
And there's
Are you telling
actually...
me we have to ring out some of the government officials here?
No. But I guess the element there is actually, and this is coming up in one of the chats, is around the acknowledgement or the truth telling aspect. Until we really, purge ourselves of the elements of guilt, of shame, of wrongdoings, in the past, and how they've been perpetuated within systems and structures and over time in society. Until we really wring that out, then unfortunately the systems aren't in the position to be able to absorb fully. And that's why I like that notion of the sponge. And I think that element of that truth telling is not only an act of purging, but it's an act of empowering as well. It's acknowledging that society has, for some people, has benefited at the expense of others. And if we're thinking about this idea of recovery or that notion of bounce back, we want to ensure that everyone has the ability to experience recovery, and being that kind of the trampoline ability to be able to bounce back and be resilient communities. And unfortunately, we can't get there. I don't feel, until we can actually come from a place of honesty, of openness, and embracement, and that only comes with truth telling and that fundamental element of empowering others in their own experiences.
I want to just get a little bit of tangential here. We'll launch a poll in a second.
The sponge wasn't tangential enough.
Given your experience in shaping Voice to Parliament, what can you see as the lessons that we can apply for recovery? What is the role of voice? In recovery?
The number one thing that we've recognized in this process has been understanding and acknowledging existing structures. So these might be formal and informal and non-formal as well. These could be linked to communities. These could be linked to family groups. These could be linked to kinship structures. So until we really, it's more than an environment scan, right? It's actually understanding how communities and groups make decisions, and recognize them and honoring those in the process of consulting. Because if a model is not viewed as legitimate in the eyes of an existing governance structure, then they're not going to participate. Because already what's worked in the past has always kind of been working. And so it's like, this is the importance of bringing groups together to co-design, but we need to actually understand and respect existing structures in all forms before we can actually start moving forward.
Okay. Let's get some audience reactions now. Guys, we're going to launch a poll. What is the most important reason for ensuring community voice shapes our system? So I'm going to launch this poll now. That poll should be in front of you. Start voting away. There's some options there. And yeah, curious to see what everyone in the room thinks. We've got 120 people here, and we've got the first votes coming through.
Oh, wow.
Well, we're starting to see some clear winners. Once we end the poll, we'll share it, and then Benson, I'm hoping you might be able to provide some reactions or thoughts around
Absolutely.
the important reasons. I'll give the audience another 10 seconds.
Oh, this is fantastic. I really love the live polling.
That's great. Now, I'm not sure everyone can see the results yet, so 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We got 75%, 78% have voted. I think, well, 80%. I think that's enough. So let's end that polling and share the results. Community knows what they want, 18%. The ticket box option, 1%. I'm glad to see that's low. The winner here, it values different perspectives and experiences. Coming in second, it enables disengaged or excluded voices to be engaged. Benson, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'll just close that poll so I can see your face. Yeah, this absolutely kind of reflects what we are hearing in regards to why people are moving into that more consultative. There's nothing more powerful than getting ahead out of the textbooks, the research and the studies, and actually speaking to people. And I think having that human experience as part of a suite of being able to understand what's driving people and driving communities, but being able to understand lived experience and how people interact. And also when we think about perspectives, these are reflective of communities, reflective of culture, reflective of values and principles in regards to framing worldviews. And so I think it's really important when we are thinking about not only just diversity, but also that next step, which is the inclusion, is ensuring that lived experience and different perspectives are at the table, providing insights.
It changes the conversation from, between the engager and the engaged. I suppose the kind of the co-designed approach where you are valuing different perspectives and experiences, enriching the process, is more of that kind of deliberative form of engagement where we're sitting down, sharing our ideas and discussion together.
Yeah.
And we're bouncing off, the wisdom and the experience and expertise of all those around the table.
Absolutely.
And just a quick plug, we are looking at deliberative forms of engagement in some of the conference sessions throughout Turn It Up. So make sure you take a look at the program and check out a few of those sessions. Let's launch our second poll and get some more reactions here from the audience. What do you feel is the greatest challenge for enabling voice into a process or a system? So let's put that out there. Okay. The votes are coming in. And just we've got about another 10, well, just slightly less than 10 minutes because Benson, as you can hear, is a very, very busy guy. So we'll be wrapping up at around 9:43.
Yep. Sorry. It's very specific.
It's that's right. It's memorable. So I'll give people another sort of 5 seconds or so for that poll. And then it'll be time for questions. So throw your questions into the chat function addressed to all panelists and attendees. And we'll get through a few or as many as we can in the time we have left. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's take a look at what we feel are the greatest challenges for enabling voice into a process. So the winner here is processes systems can often seem too rigid to enable voice in them.
Yeah, absolutely. We see this across the board, and we think about that some of these systems have been set up for a particular group in mind, at the exclusion of others. Then if we already apply that kind of frame, then we just know automatically that there are some voices, or a lot of voices, and a lot of communities that are just their opinions and their views and their experiences are not able to actually be fed into this, because it's almost different frame of being and different frames of mind. And I think the coming back to that idea of that vulnerability is not only people outside systems, but more importantly, people within systems, the people I like to call the disciplined nonconformists, the ones that work within systems to be able to change systems. This is where, these disciplined nonconformists are so important, where they can actually, they're the person in the room that's willing to raise their hand and say no, say no, not this time, and to actually hold a mirror up to an organization or an institution and say, well, we need to think about who we're excluding. And the question that I always like is that question of, well, whose voice is missing? And I think that starts a very important journey for an institution. And then also, is this by lack of engagement or is this by design? And more often than not, we'll come to a point of, particularly in old institutions, that it is actually, if you look back at the early constitutions, its early history and its establishment, there's elements of by design. And when it's by design, that means things can change, because you can actually redesign and redevelop. And I think this is where we need both sides of the equation, not only the community engagement, but the institutional engagement as well, to be able to then step into a space of vulnerability and step into a focus or an action of co-design to be able to create a the right interface and the right mechanism to hear and to value and to actually affect.
Benson, thank you very much. I'm going to take some questions out from the audience, and I love that disciplined nonconformist. I think this is a call to action that we can all take from today to write that down and really challenge and test the organisations, institutions, the systems we work in a disciplined way, over and over and over again, to ensure that we can change by design the entrenched disengagement that we might be seeing across our work. A couple of questions. Natasha, if you have a great number of voices involved in a co-designing a project's implementation, how do you make anything happen? Lots of opinions means differing opinions, everything grinds to a halt. What are your strategies for dealing with the multiple voices slowing things down?
This is where actually structuring the process of consultation, the providing different ways to provide feedback and input is really important, but the role of the facilitator is absolutely key. And what we've found, particularly working in communities, in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, is actually someone who's known locally, someone who's very much respected, someone that already has a position of power or authority or trust. I think that's the element that is critical here, that is able to call people up, that is able to lead a session, that is able to pivot. It's a very dynamic skill as a facilitator, and I think that's the key piece, is ensuring that there's different ways to feed into it, that it's not just let's fill a town hall and hold a public hearing. It's actually, let's break it up into small groups, potentially, if it's culturally appropriate, to do men and women's groups, smaller groups, looking at different ways to feedback, whether it's through the use of technology, through conversation, through written pieces, through art. It's looking at all the tools as a facilitator at your disposal to get the best out of the group, and to give the group the best possible opportunity to provide the feedback and not feel intimidated, but to feel safe in that space. And this is where I think establishing a really important group agreement, and then, rather than rules of engagement, it's a group agreement. And kind of, I like the term striving towards groupness. And groupness is I find it a very kind of embracing kind of term, where it's actually about all of us in this together trying to get to an outcome.
Yeah. One more question. We've only got 2 minutes of your time, Benson. So just a quick one. What advice would you give to an organisation wanting to engage with local Indigenous community?
Yeah, so this comes back to will. There's no shortage of will from organisations wanting to connect to community. The thing that I don't necessarily see is from some organisations is a why, beyond we want to engage more community and have them in our organization. What are you wanting to achieve from it? And unless it's touching on things around, changing our organization to support the greater engagement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, there has to be a very clear why, because also that why will set up, or who do I actually need to speak to? And then, how can, and why would they actually want to be a part of, our engagement or of our organization? So it's actually a bit of greater reflection beyond just the idea of being an inclusive organization. There needs to be a clear purpose. Again, communities are some of the most consulted and researched. So unless we're kind of going in there with a clear understanding of, this is why we want community to be involved, because not only do we value, but we want to bring the value of community into shaping our organization.
Benson, thank you very much for joining us today. On behalf of the audience, the virtual audience that we have, it's been a real, very interesting session full of insights, and I just wanted to thank you for taking the time out, and best of luck with your new role and heading over to Texas. We wish you all the best and the very best of luck on that.
No worries. Thanks so much for having me. Take care.
Thank you very much, Benson. And for all those with us in the audience, thank you for attending the first session of Turn It Up. I would like to remind you to make sure that you sign up for our newsletter, so you're able to get a copy of today's session and all other sessions which will be recorded via video. We'll also be sending out PowerPoint presentations from the sessions throughout the conference via this newsletter, along with evaluation. So we highly recommend you sign up for that. On that note, I'd like to thank you all for attending the first session of Turn It Up. We'll wrap it up now, and I'd like to make a strong reminder that we have our next session starting at 10 a.m. this morning with Ben Neal on how to make engagement accessible. We look forward to seeing you in that session. It's going to be a great one.